Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the show. Got a great episode today. Anya Cates is on the show. She's become a good friend of mine recently. We met and hung out in Denver, and she's got a great podcast called A Millennial's Guide to Saving the World that some of you may have heard. I was on episode 31 entitled Waking Up to Ourselves in the World with Mike Adelic Brancatelli. And you can check that out by going to Apple Podcasts, where her podcast is, or everywhere that podcasts are found. And it's great. She's really kind of honed in this mission, this mantra, this purpose, this vision, looking at our generation, this generation of the second largest, or we might be the largest now generation since the baby boomers, but definitely the children of the boomers, myself and Anya being more towards the higher end of the spectrum, and then, people like who are in their, maybe around 23, 24 at the lower end of the spectrum. And then those Generation Zers, I don't know what we're going to do with you guys, but it's up to us. We are starting to emerge into higher positions in the world and in the workforce and in the economy and the society and the culture. Hopefully what I am creating here with this show and what Anya is creating with her show is able to kind of leave a mark and make a mark in a cultural way, reach out, touch people, and have conversations that we're not hearing at, anywhere else. And so I want to actually just read her podcast description, because I think it's pretty cool, and you can get a good idea of what her show's all about. Of course, we talk about it in the show, but she says, this podcast has one mission: to rally a generation that's been labeled and groomed as lazy, triggered, and entitled, and invite us all to write a new story, one of a generation that's willing to challenge the status quo, reject black and white thinking, and opt out of each and every repressive system and box that we've been placed in. Above all else, I want to invite millennials to step up to the plate, to be vulnerable in owning our responsibility to ourselves for walking this planet through the darkest of days. It's time to dream new dreams, write new stories, and create new futures. The great work begins. I just love that. That's been a lesson that I've been learning in my life as I've been doing plant medicine work and healing work. That it's this sort of and all these articles coming out. I remember even 5 years ago, the millennial generation, are they lazy? Are they entitled? They don't want to work. They're complaining a lot, all this stuff. People, of course, everybody likes to project onto other people and say, oh, look at what they're doing. It doesn't matter if it's individuals and relationships and friendships, if you're a part of a corporation, a company, a society, a government, whatever it is. There's always a level of projection that happens to kick the can down the road, put it on someone else, blame somebody else for it, and look at these new millennials and their wacky ideas. They're radical. They want to shake things up. Oh, it looks like millennials don't want to buy homes. Isn't that? They're changing the economy. It's scary. Oh, millennials aren't doing this or that. They're not having kids. They're not settling down. The world's going to end. We're all going to die. It's all terrible. Everything that we know, right? Everything that this generation above us, the generations above us, everything they fear, everything that they judge, everything that they look at is just a challenge to the world that they've become so familiar with. And when you become familiar with a world, even if it's not healthy, you have a certain allegiance to that world because it provides you with a certain level of comfort. There's a certain level of comfort that comes from the familiarity of what you have always known, even if it's not serving you anymore, even if it's something that is detrimental. You will hear people defend things like that all the time. People defend that kind of stuff all the time. And it's an ideological blanket that we kind of smother ourselves in. Talking with Daniel Pinchbeck and Chris Ryan, and I'm going to have Charles Eisenstein on the show recently. I've been listening a lot to this guy, Daniel Schmachtenberger. which is a great name. And he talks, I think he has a blog called Civilization Emerging. We've been really moving more into this kind of civilizational level thinking and emergent properties, and looking at things in terms of organisms and collective units and bodies of voluntary and spontaneous congregation, organization and expression. And it's really quite something to see, because a lot of the old ideas that we've had don't really serve us anymore. We are entering into a new story, but it's also a familiar one too. It's also an old story as well. You know, it's this sort of archaic revival, this sort of like coming back to our roots, using the lessons and the technology and the progression that we've made and that we've advanced with in this world. And you know, Pinchback talked about this in his book How Soon Is Now in 2017, and the reason why I loved it so much is because when he identified that we're sort of unconsciously willing catastrophe into our lives to wake us up. And I think that really is what's going on. I think we do it in our lives. I think everybody does it, right? I think basically human nature is to do the least amount of work, to do the least amount of output to get the most amount of results. So, you know, if we're not being forced to work, if we're not being forced to produce something or to do something, we're most likely not going to do it. We're going to always opt for the easier way. And you could be saying, oh, not me. I get up and I run 7 miles and I do the New York Times crossword puzzle and the Sudoku. And then I, drink a kale shake and, I do 100 push-ups and I stand on a rock with one foot looking at the sunrise, whatever. Good for you. But there's most people, I'd say the majority of people don't wake up until faced with catastrophe. Sometimes it takes catastrophe to jolt us awake, to see things in a new light, or to evolve to a higher state of being. Sometimes it takes this tremendous hero's journey shouting from the bottom of a cave saying, are you going to walk this path, or will I shake the ground beneath you and crumble you to your demise? And we're like, well, what are we going to do? Will we go with the familiar, comfortable path and just say, okay, well, I guess it's good for now. I'll just kind of hold on and hang on. Or are we going to accept the challenge and try and purposefully and intentionally, respectfully, and in a really graceful way, evolve to a higher state of being? And I believe that is capable. And I think it's unprecedented because of the time that we live in right now with the internet. But I also know human beings, I know history, and I know how I behave in my life. I usually wait until shit hits the fan, and then I'm like, oh shit, I didn't see that. We see it unfold throughout history, in our collective and personal histories, our individual lives, but in the story that we tell that we call history. When devastation occurs, like the likes of Pearl Harbor, 9/11, Katrina, these are all times when the majority of us get kicked in the head and we kind of come online. We're forced to look. We're forced to pay attention. We're forced to see things in a different way. We're thrust into a whole new paradigm of being. We're forced to either elevate and evolve or die, disintegrate, crumble, and obliterate, right? We're either going to evolve to a higher state of consciousness collectively on a planetary level, or we're going to blow ourselves up. We're going to destroy ourselves. We're going to pollute the oceans. We're already on that track. We're on it. If you look at the macro and you zoom it down to the micro, to the individual, who's doing it? Is it the individuals that are feeding the collective? Is it the collective that's feeding the systems that are feeding the individuals? I think it's a little bit of both, right? Because we have, if we look at the great societies, I would say, or the great communities, tribes, they sort of understood that it takes a certain kind of leadership, a certain kind of wise old elder to guide, to be there to guide, to encourage, to show the way, to lead by example, to have a sort of detached perspective, looking at the society with fresh eyes from a mountaintop above, the outsider, as Alan Watts talks about, the one on the fringes, on the edge, to inform the society, to be there, the court jester, the joker, the one that informs the king of his follies, the only one that can speak the truth. We've sort of kind of cut this out of our mainstream Western world. We don't really have these sorts of things, and we don't really have rites of passage. So therefore, the citizens, the people, are sort of lost, and they're trying to make up their own stories. Some people are making up good ones. Some people are just going with the flow and feeding into what's being sold to them. But either way, we find ourselves on a track where we're faced with catastrophe. And in your personal life, in my personal life, sometimes it takes catastrophe. Sometimes it takes, a 9/11 to just wake me up and jolt me out of my sleep and say, oh my God, I didn't even realize I was doing this, this, and that. I didn't even see that. But now, because of this event, whatever it is, you lose a job, a relationship, an apartment, a friendship, a car, whatever, something that you had goes away, you got robbed or whatever. Any of these major events that can happen, really, if we think about those moments and we reflect on them, the most of us, when something major like that happens and we lose a loved one or something, that we're really forced to reflect and really forced to think about what's going on. You oftentimes hear people talk about, I got in this terrible, accident. I was skiing, I hit a tree, my legs were broken. I got rushed to the hospital. They thought I was going to die, and then you see how that person recovered and they made it out. And now their story is one of like, they're living every day to the fullest. They're taking full advantage of everything that life has to offer because they were faced with the end. They were faced with doom, peril, demise. They were faced with death, tragedy, non-existence. Everything that they ever knew was going to go away, and it forced them to change their perspective. So many times, these events in our world, they will challenge us. They will question us. They will ask us questions. They will say, hey, is this true? Question the nature of your reality. They may present an opportunity for us to examine the narrative structure of the story that we thought we knew. Now we have to be able to hold this information, though, right? Like, that's one of the things, and what I'm getting at with the people that are critical of other people, the millennials, you're lazy or you're doing this, or I'm triggered and you have to respect my space. And, there might be elements of truth to all these things. It might not be so black and white, like Anya says in her podcast description. And I don't think it is. I think that we really need to inject more nuance. We really need to be able to hold the power of paradox in our minds. It takes a lot of cognitive energy to do that. But if you can see other people's perspectives, if you can hold paradox in your mind and split the differences between them, just examine, but be prepared for challenge your sacred cows, so to speak. As Jamie Wheel was saying, I was listening to him talking about this, like, be prepared to challenge your sacred cows, the sense making and the beliefs that we take for granted and assume them to be a fundamental or foundational given. Just as we assume them to be true, right? So it's like, hey, like the universe is unfolding the way it is. Everything is perfect, and everything is perfect, and everything is peaceful and loving and great, and it's the way that it's supposed to be. Even the darkness in the world, it's all in perfect harmony, and this is playing out as a perfect story. Challenge that notion. Hey, psychedelics are great tools for healing, and could really benefit a lot of people, and the world could be a better place if just everybody had access to psychedelics. I mean, okay, let's challenge that one too, right? Hey, the non-aggression principle, it's a pretty good moral philosophy, right? No one should initiate aggression on anybody else. You should be able to have your Your property should be safe. No one should steal. No one should hurt you. Okay, let's examine that. People have been examining these things for thousands and thousands of years, and we have a tendency in our American culture to just rest on the pinnacle of an idea that we think is a pinnacle of an idea, but it's not, because we're lazy, and human beings want to do the least amount of work and get the most out of it. And you don't want to challenge the status quo, especially in the scientific paradigm, because people have put in their work and their time, and they've come up with their theories, and they've got money invested in this, and they've got reputation on the line, and they're not going to go back and start altering their papers and their books and saying, hey, looks like I was wrong. Oftentimes it doesn't. Rupert Sheldrake talks about this in The Science Delusion, or Science Set Free, as it's called in the American version. But we have to be able to look at the things that we hold to be true the most. Hey, I'm a good person, right? Are you? Let's examine it. Examine all of it. Hey, I believe in open trade and free market democracy. I think that's the height of success, and that's the height of evolution. Is it? I forget who said this. I think Graham Hancock says, science tends to act like we have, where we're at right now in the world, we have about 99% of everything figured out, and we're just kind of looking to fill in that 1%, missing piece. I think it's completely the opposite. I think we got 1% down, and there's 99% that we need to figure out. But we all do this, and we do it because we're unwilling to challenge our most sacred core beliefs, the most sacred ways, the most intense personal ways in which we really see the world. What do we really believe? What is the sense-making structures and the beliefs that we just assume to be true, and that we are unwilling to shake, and unwilling to have being poked at, and inspected? And there's traps along this path too. There's traps of spiritual bypassing, right? Just using spirituality as an escape from all the problems, using spirituality as a checkout, using psychedelics as a checkout, spiritual materialism, running around the world collecting spiritual experiences and psychedelic experiences and yogic experiences and altered state experiences, and just collecting them to ornaments to put on your shelves so that you could talk about the one time that you had a profound experience and you saw God and you talked to God. The implementation of the practice, of the journey, the nuance, the gray, the willingness to accept the darkness and the light and hold it both together at the same time, because there's a third thing there. There's lots of things there. We have to be able to look at these traps that are laid out along our path and say, let's not get sucked into social media all day. Let's not binge watch Netflix all day. Let's try and address some of the larger problems in our lives and in the world. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit harder to compost, but maybe you start doing it and it's fun and you learn about it, and then other people do it. I got a squatty potty, and I heard about that a while ago. Someone had one. I was like, this is great. Ordered one, got it. It's better for me, right? This is on a small scale. But there's a lot of these things that we could do. You might have someone that would say, hey, you have a squatty potty. And they're like, oh, that's bullshit. I'm not using that. What is it, millennial trash or stupid thing? Just go on the damn toilet, sit down, and shut up. There's a lot of people in this country like that. They just have their beliefs. This is the way it is. That's the way it's going to be done. But if you're open to exploring, you start to open new doors. Life becomes richer, more novel, more diverse, more interesting. And the what can come out of that, who knows? But we must be willing to accept the dismantling of all of our sacred, preconceptions and little stories and narratives that make us feel comfortable, make us too comfortable, like a real comfy, heavy blanket that's just suffocating us. We have to have the ability to hold really unstable possibilities, destabilizing ideas that are just unsettling and even, simultaneously contradictory at times. And look at, what are we projecting? What are we aware of? What beliefs and sense-making structures are we willing to deeply question, perform surgery on? And we all have them. So, we are the kings of our own kingdoms, and sometimes it takes the people rising up and marching up to our doors in protest with demands for change. But, what can we do to prevent it? What can we do to actually actively work in a way to administer preventative ideas, preventative solutions sometimes maybe some of us are being called on this journey and being challenged to go down this path so that we can come up with those ways. Who knows? But I think we're going to find out today in this wonderful conversation with my amazing new friend Anya Cates. I think she's such a wonderful person, and I love hanging out with her and having her on the show. And she's just doing really great things, as you guys will hear. Anyway, that's it. Check out Navigating Psychedelics by Psychedelics Today. All the links for stuff will be in the show notes. Gonna be super excited to have this new sponsor on the show, Brew Doctor Kombucha. They're just really dope. I love their stuff. So totally psyched to be bringing them on, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And go to Hemp Bombs, get CBD sent anywhere in the country. They have hemp-derived CBD products that are really great. I like the gummies. They definitely help me sleep. And Synchro offers plant-based and keto nutrition products, so go check that out. The links will be down in the show notes as well. You get 20% off when you enter the code Mycadelic for Synchro, and you get 15% off when you enter the code in Hemp Bombs. It's Mike15, and all that information is in the show notes. But also, I like that you guys are fans of the show and that you just want to support what you love. And, I love the idea of the sharing economy and the gift economy and the fund what you love thing. And, I think that I really want to sort of try and do different things with the show to try and get it to be at a place where everybody feels like it's good and that you want to, if you want to support it, you can. Anyway, whatever. I got a Patreon page, so just check that out too. If you got a couple bucks hanging around and you want to send them my way, send them my way. It's amazing. I love that help and support that I get from everybody that does that. So go to patreon.com/Mike Brank. That's BRANC. You can donate as little as $1, $2, $3, whatever it is. Alternatively, if you just want to make a one-time donation, I got a PayPal. Just go on my website, mikebrank.com, and you go to PayPal. This show is 100% done by me, nobody else, and I've been doing it this way for 3 years, and I want to keep doing it this way. So if you like what you hear, do that. If you just want to go to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review, that's another huge way that gets people's attention, that helps the show grow, that it shows up higher in the algorithms. People are able to see it, and then we're able to have just better conversations. I have so many big ideas and big plans for this show, and I just don't have the resources to carry them out all right now. And I see a lot of cool things happening. I want you guys to experience just this wave of coolness that's going to be shooting out of my third eye into this show and beaming it with like a rainbow colored fractal geometric pattern honeycomb breathing web of psychedelic gooey goodness to just get this thing to be where I want it to be in a creative way, with guests, with clips and artwork and music and all kinds of. I want this to be a really full 360-degree experience for people listening. So that's where I want to go with it. Check all that stuff out. Follow me on Instagram, Mycadelic_podcast. And of course, follow our guest, Anya, and all of her stuff will be in there. Without further ado, let's get in the conversation. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Psychedelics are illegal, not because a loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally laid down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong.
We don't need new laws that control our consciousness and rigidly place it in a prison.
Cognitive liberty. The fact that as adults, if we're not hurting anybody else, we should have the right to explore the contours of our own consciousness without any mediation or legislation on the part of somebody else.
Reject authority. Authority is a lie.
Or is it perception?
Information is power, but we have to seize the opportunity. The opportunity.
Well, Anya Cates, thank you so much for coming to Mycadelic Studios here in this, beautiful Denver day, nice and sunny out.
Thank you. Super profesh.
Super profesh. Such
my podcast
such a
studio.
Millenn thing to say.
Yeah, let's just do that the whole time. Not.
Well, I'm just like so psyched to sit down and speak with you, and I hope that we can have like a, just like a cool, free-flowing, open conversation. I listened to about half of the first episode of your podcast, A Millennial's Guide
To saving the world.
to Saving the World. Cool. Love it. Love the intro. I love what you were talking about. Like, I resonate with it so much, and I think we talked about this when we did your show when I was on, and I thought about that. I was like, was I good on that? Like, because I just did Chris's show, and I felt like I had kind of like went so far and talked about so many things that by the time we had like 10 minutes in between, I was like, I had maybe like podcast fatigue. So I hope I was good.
It was awesome.
It was good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm always a nervous wreck and just like,
It was fine.
Yeah. Okay, cool. But yeah, anyway, so we spoke about some of these things and like how we have these similarities and stuff. And I was wondering maybe if you would just kind of share a little bit. So of your story, I'll kind of lead in with the fact that we're both randomly from the same town or one town over in New York. We both kind of found Chris Ryan and Tangentially Speaking and his book, his work, and felt kind of attracted to that and those ideas. And you are a millennial and I am a millennial, and we're part of this generation, and we both kind of feel the need to make an impact and share and communicate in a way that's authentic and unique to discover these ideas that are going around. And yeah, maybe I'll stop stammering on about this and let you give a little bit of your story, your journey, and what led you to this.
Yeah, man, my story. It's interesting. I feel like growing up, I lived like both a very conventional and unconventional life. I grew up in suburbia outside Manhattan. I switched schools some, went to private school, went to public school. And on the surface, I talk about this a lot. Like on the surface, what my life was very different from what it was behind the scenes. So I think probably one of the biggest self-defining moments or just situations in my life is that my dad is gay, and knew that prior to being married to my mom. It's like an interesting way that kind of worked out.
Wait, he knew that, or
Yeah. So
and she knew that too?
Yeah. So it was, my dad was in his early 20s and living in New York in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had him on the podcast. It was probably one of my favorite episodes that I did.
Oh, great. What episode is that? Do you remember the number? 21. Okay,
Yeah.
Cool.
It's called the Rod and Anya Show.
Okay. His name's Rod.
Yeah. Roderick.
Ooh. You don't really hear that name too much
No,
anymore.
not
That's a
at
good
all.
name.
Yeah.
Nice.
It is a good name. Yeah, so he was in his early 20s, living in New York in the early 80s. He kind of left home at a young age. His parents were pretty cool. He was working in theater, so like everything around him was pretty confusing and hectic at that time. What he really wanted more than anything was to find intimate, romantic, emotionally intimate relationship with someone. And he couldn't find that with guys who were gay in their early 20s. And he was frustrated because he's like, I feel like this is who I am, but like I want a partner and I can't find a partner. And not only that, but people were dying all over the place. So it was sort of this weird, like...
You're referring to like the 80s AIDS epidemic,
yeah.
and that whole crisis, right?
Yeah, and it was before anybody really knew what was going on. It was just like
scary time,
gay men
yeah.
are dying. Yeah.
Right.
So he sort of felt validated and like, maybe that's not the best idea. And I think similar to how, in a way that we all do this, or at least a lot of us in our early 20s especially, is we think that we can't have it all, right? Like, I didn't think I could have an intimate relationship and explore non-monogamy, so I like made a choice. And for him, he didn't think he could be gay and have an emotionally intimate relationship, so he chose one over the other. And he knew my mom. They'd been friends. I think at the time my dad thought he was bisexual. And yeah, they were together on and off. And then finally, like, I think at least the way they've told it a couple times is like, hey, if nothing ever works out for us, let's just get married and have kids. My mom was 10 years older. And yeah, that's basically what happened. They got married and they had kids. And a few years after having me, right around the time they had my brother, my dad finally was like, like, I'm gay. I can't do it. So they got divorced, but I didn't find out he was gay until 5 years after that. After he was in a long-term, like he was in a 10-year relationship with a guy pretty soon after they got divorced. Yeah, and it was this very, like, crazy moment for me of, this was now the mid-90s. The year I found out he was gay was the year Matthew Shepard was killed, which is this young kid who was, like, tied to a fence in Wyoming, and a lot of gay rights legislation was created because of that. Very different time than now. And my parents had decided they'd tell me and my brother when we asked. And through a very strange series of events, I finally asked at age 10. And this was after, like, my dad lived with a guy. I saw him holding hands with a guy, kissing a guy. He was just my dad's friend. Anyway, so I was talking to my mom, and I was like, you know, but Dad holds hands with Sean. That doesn't mean he's gay, does it? My mom's like, well, actually, he is gay. And I had this moment at 10 where, and like, he lived around the corner. My parents were pretty cordial, and she's like, I'm going to have him come over. And I said no, because I knew gay was bad. I didn't really understand what it was, but I thought I knew it was bad. And I was like, there's something I've missed this whole time. My dad's going to walk in. He's going to be a monster. He's going to have, like, horns, or like I missed it. Like, he's a terrible person. Anyway, he walks in. He's the same dude that I loved. I was really close to him. And so I had this moment of like, okay, hold on. So gay is bad, but my dad is gay, and my dad's not bad. So, like, that's bullshit. And what else is bullshit?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I would say from then on, I questioned everything. I think first sort of subconsciously, and then consciously learned what, like, a social construction was, and studied gender and sexuality in school. And then interestingly, I think sort of similar to my dad in my early 20s, made a similar decision of thinking, like, well, I don't really know what to do with my degree, and I don't know how to live this life, and I think I know who I am, but I don't feel like there's a place for me in this world, and life is about sacrifice. So I got married, lived a really conventional life, bought a house in San Diego, and in my late 20s, through another sort of series of events, sort of violently exited my life, which catapulted me.
What violently? Oh, I
exited my life. Yeah. So got divorced. I moved out of my house, moved in with my mom. That was fascinating. I had all these health issues. Like, I basically just really wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. Like, why'd I chosen the relationships I'd chosen, and where I went, right? Like, where my authenticity went, and delving through lots of childhood stuff and codependency stuff, and basically isolated myself in an apartment in Topanga for a couple of years to figure it out, and like read a lot and spent a lot of time alone and cried a lot. And I say reinvented myself, but I don't think that's what I did. I think I was just like shedding an inauthentic skin and got back to who I actually was.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this the other night when we were walking to the restaurant and you were sharing this. And back to your father in that instance, it's making me think about, because you had explained how you really have this kind of unique perspective now because you've been through sort of a unique situation. And the situation that you went through, it was kind of a cordial, right, and like uniquely, respectfully designed situation between consenting adults and everybody in there, and it was sort of amiable and not what society would deem to be the kind of situational outcome. Like, oh, this is the case, what a horrific tragedy, and that wasn't really the case. So that kind of helped move you into a different way of looking at things. But then you found yourself also in this situation where you were involved with things that weren't really serving you, or where you weren't being authentic. And I think you shared a little bit about that. I was wondering maybe if you could share a little bit again as to what that was, because I think we were talking also about generally this happens a lot, maybe to young girls too, where they get involved in something. And I think you could say it better than I can. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I I was pretty naive to just like the inner workings of my own choices and patterns, which I think we all are up until a certain point. So I had a pretty challenging relationship with my mom growing up. Again, one of those things that looked okay on the outside, but was like very sort of toxic and dramatic on the inside. Very codependent. What I learned was love was very transactional. Like, if I do this for you, you do this for me. It was very emotionally absent. So lots of like, well, you get, here's a gift, or like you go to camp, so therefore you are loved. But I wasn't aware of that. I didn't know it was wrong or different or problematic. And so I ended up basically mimicking that type of relationship in my romantic life. My dad, I had a different relationship with, but I lived predominantly with my mom. My mom's the female, I think. So I think I was more inclined to kind of like replicate her behaviors than I was my dad's.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's where it started, was that I was pretty desperate to like merge with somebody. And that happened for me in romantic relationships. I was in a relationship from 16 to 22, and then only left it because I met the guy I ended up marrying and was with him from 22 to like 27. And then decided to leave my marriage because I had met someone else. And that was the beginning of like, Anya, okay, like this is a pattern. You've also never been single.
It's amazing that you're able to recognize that, though, because a lot of people don't get to that point of recognition. What do you think it was that helped you come to that realization?
Well, I think, and in all these situations, in those relationships, they should have ended much prior than they did, right? Like, I wasn't happy. I was basically I wanted the relationship so bad that I was willing to sacrifice a lot of my own identity. You want that? Does that mean we get to stay together? Cool, I'll sacrifice this and this and this, to where it became like a shell of a person. And in the last situation, the person I met was really fucking cool, and I really respected him, and I was really like excited about my life and my future. And I remember like driving. I was living in San Diego, and I kept going up to LA to spend time up there because I had friends there and my mom had lived there. And I remember driving from San Diego once. It was just like a bad situation with my ex. I pretty much told him right away, like, I want a divorce. This hasn't been working for a long time, which he knew. Like, there was lots of crap that went down. But anyway, I was driving from San Diego to LA, and I remember thinking to myself, I don't feel any grief about the ending of my marriage. And that seems like a problem. Like, I'm not a cruel human. I know there were issues in this relationship, but this is someone who I loved, someone who I still love in many ways, someone who I, really didn't want to give up on, someone who I spent, we were for years in therapy. We moved across the country together. We'd overcome, like betrayals and all this kind of stuff. I was super committed to it, and yet in this sort of like distraction, right, I wasn't feeling anything. And that just kind of bothered me. And I don't know. It's hard. It was so many different things. But that was the first sort of realization. And then I think moving in with my mom, also was really eye-opening to me, because I think when I decided like there's something wrong here, I thought like there must be patterns and processes that aren't super healthy, and then starting to figure out if that's the case, then those must have come from somewhere. And kind of like reverting to my childhood and going back to live with my mom it was hard to ignore. Let's just say that.
Well, I had that happen to me. And I think this is like a common sort of trope with our millennial generation. I'll see articles that say like, 30% of people under 30 are now moving back in with their parents and things like that. It's like, oh, this generation sucks. Look at them. But I remember when that happened to me, And I think what you're alluding to with moving back in with your mom and being kind of face to face with that, there was this sort of imprinting that happened with you, with her, and relationships and the mimicking and playing those out, in your life, not really realizing it in a conscious way. And I had a very similar thing. So when I had to go back to my parents' house after leaving at 18 years old and being out on my own, and at 31 having to move in back with my parents, it was like so devastating. But I also had a moment where I said, maybe this is going to be healing for me. Mm-hmm. Like maybe there's something here that I need to revisit, some past wounds that need to be healed. And I totally got that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did too. There was a moment when things got so bad that my dad came out. And so my dad, I don't know why we thought this was a good idea, but my dad came out and stayed at my mom's house with me and my mom. And like, I'm going through this like horrible trauma and like crying. And there was all these debates around like, my mom offered to have me come live with her, but then very quickly felt, I think, crowded, and was like, I didn't have anywhere to go. Like, I can't go back to that house with my ex-husband who's not being very nice, and I have nowhere else to go. And I was like dealing with all sorts of physical issues, and it was just like I barely leave the house. That was like a struggle.
Yeah. What kind of physical issues were you?
Lots of just like, everything, digestive issues, hormonal issues. I was talking to someone last night. I think I had sort of lingering moderate health issues since I was a baby, which I'm now quite clear were the result of the, mental and emotional space that I was in. And I think I was, I was one of those people. There's this great book called Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. And she likens depression to what she calls grandiosity. So that like there are people that do one of two different things in order to escape their problems. They either get depressed and shut down and don't do anything, or they overcompensate. So they're like, they're constantly busy and working and performing, and like that's like, but look, everything's fine. And I definitely fit into that boat. And I think I was able to kind of just push everything down by constantly like overperforming and working really hard and doing all these activities. And
because if it looks good from the outside, then it must be good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she says this really great thing in the book, which I only read after having this experience, is like what happened to me was like I became incapacitated. I couldn't work. I couldn't like work out. I couldn't pretend like I was okay, because I wasn't. And with the absence of that, like I was forced to be like, who the fuck am I if I'm if I can't be defined by those sort of like performative things, like who am I and do I like myself? I remember asking myself like, Anya, if you had one arm, would you still love yourself? And the answer was like, not at all. And I was like, that's a problem. Like, would you still love yourself if you couldn't do blah, blah, blah? No. Okay, that's a problem. So like, I have to redefine this. And so I think when I was able to, or not was able to, I was forced to just like do nothing, that I think like all of that toxicity in my body was free to kind of come out. It was like, you have the space in your life now to handle this. And thank goodness I worked for myself, so I didn't have to go into a job. I was able to kind of like moderate the amount of work I was doing, so I didn't have to even work that much. And I just retreated and knew that the physical stuff I was going through was just a manifestation of the emotional stuff. Like it was funny too. I did like a parasite cleanse at the time, which was a dumb choice in terms of timing. But I did this, and like I had this. It was so much felt like I was like, I'm like eliminating parasites from my whole life and my body. Right? It was like the mirroring of physical and emotional stuff.
Yeah. Well,
so,
that's a big thing, and something that I've been getting into more recently, because I've always been so focused about the mind, like it's everything. It's our, our psyche and all this stuff. But recently I've been going to these ketamine therapy sessions where they take a somatic based approach. It's more about how the energy and the emotions and the tension and like the dis-ease of what's going on in our body manifests into all of these issues, right? So we have like the nervous system, and the nervous system functions in terms of like, you're at baseline and there's no threats and there's no worries, but then you go up in and down into this like fight or flight mode until you really go down into this numb kind of like totally void space, which can be really hard to get back out of. But the fact that you're having these health issues or body issues rather, that's actually something that's informing you of something that's going on.
Yeah, and it always was. And I think honestly that's why it took so long for them to go away, because I recognized how informative they were. And like I had done every test and taken every supplement, and like I would be on the same protocol and be okay, and then something stressful would happen in my life and all the problems would come back, but yet the supplements and the protocol I was taking didn't change. And at one point, relatively recently actually, like 7-8 months ago, I decided to stop every single supplement, like everything. To sort of test this theory around like how much of my health is emotionally based. And I'm pretty sure at this point it's like 95%, which was empowering, like I'm not going to try and cover up. And that's what's sort of interesting about all of this too. Another weird similarity we have is that we both worked in marketing. And I was working for natural products companies until maybe 25 or so. And then I quit my in-house job and consulted for a couple of brands, but I also had a health and wellness blog. And, I had for so long thought that all of my problems could be solved by fixing the physical stuff. And so I had this whole blog that was basically about that. Like, if you eat this paleo muffin and you take these supplements, like, all your problems will be solved. And when I realized that wasn't true, I couldn't do it anymore. So I was just like, I'm not going to sit here and have this public facing image and this brand and this blog that talks about all of these things that I, at this point, realize are only a fraction of the truth.
Right.
And so that was sort of like part of the erasing or exiting out of my life. I was just like, nope, not going to do that anymore. And if I'm going to have a public facing image and I'm going to be out in the world, then it's going to be truthful and comprehensive,
Nice. Yeah, I was just checking my phone because I was looking for this Lao Tzu quote that you mentioned. Well, you were bringing it up on your podcast, and I thought it was relevant to bring up. But yeah, I hear you. About that, because there's what you're talking about here, and the reason why I wanted to get to that was because you had to heal yourself. You had to go through this ordeal, or sort of like a rite of passage, right? And I think that this is something that's kind of lacking in our modern times. And I think that a lot of what we've experienced, because you have obviously your unique story of Anya Cates, like that is your unique story and nobody else has that story. And I have my story, but I think our stories are connected to this moment in time, and a lot of people can resonate with this because they're going through something similar. Maybe it's not the same exact thing, but it's similar, right? And there's this kind of idea that I'm thinking of like, well, our parents kind of grew up with this lie of like how life should be and how to be in the world and how relationships should be and how we should interact with the world and what we should be caring about and involved with. And that's just kind of like no longer serving us anymore. So there's like a crumbling or like problems that we just can't run away from. And a lot of people in our generation are being called to sort of shamanize, for a lack of a better term. But the traditional role of a shaman is someone who heals themselves so that they can then offer something back to the community. So I was kind of hoping maybe we could segue into what you're doing now with your podcast and sort of your general philosophy on life. These ideas that you've come to. So you're not recommending paleo muffins necessarily anymore, but you have other things that you're working on. So take me through like the evolution of the creation of this and these ideas and what you thought about during this process after you kind of got yourself squared away.
Yeah. The tagline, unofficial tagline for my podcast is "Fix yourself to fix the world." And what I realized recently, I don't think this was totally intentional, but one thread that I realize exists through all of the conversations that I've had on my podcast is this process of deconstructing and reconstructing. And I think if there's one thing that our generation, people in their 20s, 30s, are, I think, particularly good at, it's being willing to do that, being willing to like tear apart the madness and, you know, enter into an open source state and figuring out like what is programming and what's authenticity. And that's horrifying. And that can happen in a myriad of different ways, you know? So in terms of all the ideas and the inspiration for the podcast and what I'm doing now was, you know, when I was going through all of this, I couldn't find my voice anywhere. This is an embarrassing story where I literally at one point remembered Googling like resources for the worst time in your life. Like, needless to say, that did not turn up very helpful results. And what I actually found a lot of was stuff about like mental illness. And at the time, there were some people who were very inclined to tell me I had mental illness. Like, oh, you're grieving. Like, you have feelings like you're ill. And I just flat out rejected that. I was like, there's no way that's true. So yeah, I struggled in finding a support group. And I think that's part of just the bullshit society and culture that we live in, that like we have no idea what community is anymore. And had I been able to sort of like grieve with others who understood what I was going through, I think that would have vastly changed the situation. I think it would have been a lot less challenging. So I knew that in going through this, that when I came out of it, that I wanted to have be that resource for at least somebody. And I think especially, like you mentioned, Chris Ryan, I listened to his podcast and agreed with a lot of what he said. I would always joke that I was like the female version of Chris Ryan, but I was like, but where is the female version of him out in the world? Like, I'm a young woman and I agree with the old white guy. Like, that's got to be unique, you know? Yeah, I wanted to, I thought I can't find my voice. Well, that's because I'm the only one with it. So, and I started like posting, it was around, this whole thing started like Trump was being elected, the Me Too movement was going on. So I was sort of like simultaneously, and I think this is what a lot of us are going through, sort of like recognizing this parallel of like, who the fuck am I and who I want to be and what the fuck is going on in the world and like, what am I going to do about it? And holy shit. And it was so intense, that parallel. And I initially started just like posting Facebook rants because I didn't know what else to do with all this. Like, and I'd like for so long hadn't expressed myself authentically, right? Because super interested in gender sexuality, always have been. That's what I did in school. It's what I wanted to do. But when I didn't have a career in that space, I didn't know where to put all that energy. So I had it, just swallowed it. And then during this time, it sort of all came out like word vomit, basically. Like, I've got 10 years worth of opinions to express. And so I started posting Facebook rants, and a lot of them at the time were about the Me Too movement and my critique of it, honestly, in many ways. And I was getting a ton of messages from women who weren't posting publicly, commenting publicly, but were like, hey, I don't have the balls to say what you're saying, but I totally agree with you. And I'm really appreciative that you're expressing these things. And thank you, because I feel less alone. So that was a big motivator for me to be like, okay, so for whatever reason, maybe my part of my skill, gift, whatever, is that I do have the balls to say it. And I'm afraid, but I'll do it anyway. And I should use that and appreciate that that's something I can do when others might not have the privilege to do so, or the courage, or whatever it is. So yeah, I started the podcast to basically have conversations that I didn't think were being had publicly. Many of them having to do with not just like topics that are taboo, but like opinions about topics that are taboo and politically incorrect. And I'm obsessed with paradox and nuance. And if I feel very strongly about something, I sort of assume that I don't know enough about it and want to like learn more about it so that I can't figure it out. Like I think the answer is the question.
Right.
You know?
Yes. I agree with you. Well, that's the paradox thing is interesting because I, for the longest time, thought like I was going to find an answer, like a definitive answer. And then there was some point that I came to that I realized like, oh, wow, like literally whatever anybody thinks can be proven by anybody else who wants to prove it.
Yeah.
Any data, any information, you can cherry pick things, you can alter statistics and make it look like this is the thing and this is the definitive truth. And we definitely like that as human beings. We like certainty. We like stories of heroes and villains, and we like a clear, definitive enemy and to say, that's the villain, let's all attack that person. But you're right, there is this kind of weird thing that happens where even if your intention is good, right? Like I'm sure a lot of the people in the Me Too movement, their intentions are good. There's a lot of trauma there. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, wanting to correct the wrongs and create justice. And I think that I'm a big believer in justice. Like I strive for that. But you expressed to me the other night, it's like, look, like, because I was like, well, what is your critique? And you're like, well, it's nuanced. And this is such an important thing to be discussing. Let's have the conversation. And the fact that people were messaging you privately and not publicly is very telling to where we're at in society, where people aren't willing to come out of their closet, but you are, and that's the strength that you have to carry that torch and say like, hey, let's have this discussion. Could we talk a little bit maybe about that? Because I think that is, maybe it's still kind of a big issue, right? Is it that maybe even not necessarily like #MeToo, but this kind of paradigm that exists now in our culture. What do you see out there that's happening, and how do you try and like insert your opinions without? Well, I guess it's kind of impossible to like make people freak out, but in the way that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes back to personal power and personal responsibility. And I think I've learned the lesson more times than I needed to, that, like, first of all, like, blame and anger might be good jumping off points, but they don't actually get anywhere. And that I fully subscribe to, like, the Carl Jung idea about, like, what you dislike most about others is what you dislike most about yourself. And I am not willing to play a blame game. Right? So I agree with you. There's a lot of awful abuses of power. There's a lot of patriarchal bullshit. There's a lot of inequalities across gender, sexuality, race, all of it. I mean, this whole fucking country was founded on genocide and bullshit. Like, it's all fucked up.
Yeah, so civilization itself is founded on that.
Yeah. There's no part of me that isn't aware of that and doesn't agree. Where I feel I disagree with people is I don't think punishing and pointing fingers is useful. So I guess in the space of, let's say, the Me Too movement, what frustrated me was that I thought often the position that women were taking relative to all of this was that of being the victim. And it was disempowering rather than empowering. And again, it's a spectrum, right? So Harvey Weinstein versus Aziz Ansari, like, these are very different situations. But taking the example of Aziz Ansari, like, yeah, maybe he was a dick, but, like, woman, like, you have so much power. Walk out, say something. Like, you weren't trying to get him to promote your career. I mean, to me, that was very much like, we can position ourselves as weak or not. And I think what's less weak is to take responsibility. So I've been in relationships with people who I was very inclined to say were abusive, emotionally abusive. And I think they were. But would they have been able to emotionally abuse me had I not been in the fucking relationship with them? Like, I wasn't being tied to a wall. I was naive and I was scared and I was, not adult enough, but I was perpetuating it by staying and excusing the bad behavior. I'd break up with someone and go back with them. I would be conscious of what they were doing that was hurting me, and I'd just ignore it because I didn't want to know the truth. So, I mean, even now, it's like I'm in a process of really trying to forgive that stuff and recognize that, like, I can take responsibility without accepting blame. And I have power. And, you know, I think the whole thing with sexuality, especially, like, I think women's sexuality is extremely powerful and feared by men. I think understandably so, given how powerful it is, given history. And I think what's happened is that because there was so much fear, that's where the control took place, right? And after the agricultural revolution, women's roles were devalued. And so it was easier for men to sort of assume power. And through this just sort of like societal and cultural power and fear is how we ended up where we were. But I don't think to me, that's understandable. To me, it's historical. To me, it's emotional. And the last thing I want to do is not give men a seat at the table or a voice, you know? Like, I want to sit down with Louis C.K. and be like, dude, let's talk about this. Like, I'm curious. I want to know.
Yeah, sure. Let me just masturbate first. Okay.
I mean, and that's the other thing. Like, I get that he has power. I mean, I get in trouble for all this all the time. Like, I get that he has power. I get that whole thing. But, like, those women could have also walked out of the room.
Well, right. And look, this is something that I was saying, and I feel like my voice is not... It's not good because I'm a straight white man. And so it's like, fuck you, whatever you say doesn't matter. But I try and shed all of those, you know, the things that I just happen to be and just kind of communicate from my heart and how I see things from maybe like a soul level. And it's like, look, we're all human beings here. We all have the same life force inside of us and we're all like autonomous and can make our own decisions. And I'm like... yeah, why can't you just say no? And then people will say, well, because it's hard, you don't understand the situation. And I'm like, well, but you're creating yourself to be a victim. Like, stand in your power. Like, stand up and say the things, you know, because as a man, I want a woman to be like, no, I don't want that. This is what I want. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And I think a lot of men do, because a lot of times we find ourselves in situations where maybe we're doing something that we shouldn't be doing or that's wrong, and we don't know it because no one's saying anything. And then we're just like, oh, okay, like, I guess this is okay. And it's a very valuable voice because women are extremely powerful. And so, yeah, what I'm wondering, like, you know, I consider you to be an empowered woman. And so what does that look like to you? What's your idea of an empowered woman or an empowered woman in a relationship, you know, and how that looks to you?
I mean, I think a lot of it's just like self-awareness and honesty. You know, and I think, and this is like, again, like going into like my most taboo opinions, but like take sexuality, for example. You know, I don't condone abuse at all. However, like, if I'm going to, like, put on, like, a sexy outfit and I'm, like, a curvaceous woman and some guy is hitting on me or compliments me on how I look, for me to think that that's offensive or uncalled for, to me, is bizarre. Like, I think I can be intelligent, I can be brave, I can be powerful, and I can be sexy. Like, it's not, we can have it all. Like, we don't have to, you know, I was always like, I would walk down the street and I would get catcalled. And I was like, am I the only woman that's like kind of into this? Like, and not offended? You know, and again, like, nuance, people, right? If someone were to come up and, you're
taking it lightly though, right? Like,
yeah, well, I just, like, yeah, I'm sexy, and I think if I were a guy, I'd think I was sexy too. And you go to Europe, I mean, especially like Spain, these things are not
right.
These are not norms. These are culturally created situations, right? And I think that was the other thing. I lived in Paris in France when I was 12. I studied gender and sexuality, which meant that I was reading about these things cross-culturally, right? And like being gay is a definition and a label and a box that we've created, but go somewhere else and like you're only gay if you're being penetrated, not if you're the penetrator, you know? So it's like if everything is
I am the penetrator.
and that was fascinating to me and freeing, right? Like if I can, and this is what I try to encourage on my podcast too, like if we can be brave and strong and aware enough to deconstruct this societal and cultural bullshit, and we truly feel like, okay, if none of that matters and I can literally do and be whatever I want to do and be, what would that look like? You know, like if you could tear it all down and start again, what would it look like? And in that version of reality for me, some guy being like, hey, sexy, is not offensive. I would do it too. You know, and I think part of this, to be fair, is a unique position that I have as a woman, and we talked about this the other night, is that the main man in my life, my dad, my main example of masculinity, was extremely healthy. And so this was someone who defied a shit ton of odds, who did his very best to live authentically, was very brave. I mean, the whole situation and leaving home young and then divorcing my mom, like time and time again, he's done things that are like super fucking powerful and manly. But he's also extremely vulnerable and cries and expresses his emotions and encourages me to do that too. So I think where I might be unique in this and able to see things from both sides is because I don't have the animosity toward masculinity or toward men, as I think a lot of people understandandly do.
Right.
I probably have more animosity toward femininity and womanhood just because of my upbringing.
Sure. I'm sure you'd agree with me too when we're talking about this in this nuanced way, having a real discussion about this. I don't think, like, it's not something that I would condone, like, oh yeah, just go out, just yell at women, just say whatever. You know, I think there's something that men have to learn too, in kind of an appropriate way of communicating, and what's like, you know, what's like offensive or what's over the line and what's not, but also this kind of like malleable area that we can both come together and say like, hey, yeah, thanks, I appreciate it, but like, come on, you know, like, or something like that. I think you alluded to like in Spain, and I know in like Brazil, it's kind of similar too, where, you know, in a lot of different countries, right, it's kind of more of this, well, you know, they're being this way, and like we're gonna just say back to them like, oh, you don't have a shot, like never in your dreams, you know. And it's kind of this teasy, playful thing. And I feel like we have a tendency in America to get so rigid and like evil, Nazi, devil, white supremacist, and it's like, whoa, let's just kind of play with what's going on here. And like you said, the deconstruction of all of these old models that are crumbling away, that are no longer serving us, we need to dive into that. And you can totally just check out on the Bliss Express and go to, you know, power yoga and, you know, drink like cacao, coffee, and you know what I mean? Like you can just totally check out and just live in like sort of your own little bubble where you don't have to touch the nasty bits. But I think in order to save the world, we might have to dive into some of that and deconstruct it and then reconstruct it, right?
Yeah, and even if it's not saving the world, I mean,
saving your world.
Yeah, well, right. And like, honestly, do I think I can really save the world? No, but I'm still going to live a life where I'm like trying or, you know, or like still living the best, most authentic truth that I possibly can. But yeah, I mean, and I think I've also like experienced like insofar as this whole like woman thing, you know, over the years and I talk about this at length on my podcast, my like sexuality and sexual expression was, I think, the one thread that like kept me real. It was the one thing that I never really sacrificed. It was the one thing that always felt like clean and pure in a world that like wanted to make it dirty and disgusting. And I think it was that really like catapulted me in this last sort of iteration of my life to sort of exit out of what was not authentic. But my point in bringing all of that up was, you know, it's been fascinating to me to see how over the years, especially in my 20s, and I see this amongst my friends as well, like I think this is a really unhealthy version of feminism where we think in order to be a powerful woman, we either have to hate men, but more importantly, we have to be more like men. And I saw myself like, I was really proud of my masculinity. I would like, yeah, I'm a really masculine woman, you know, I'm this and that. And then I had this thought of like, maybe Anya, like, you're not a masculine woman, you're just like a woman, but that version of a woman has been lost in this day and age, you know? And I would see myself like wearing more masculine clothes and acting, you know, honestly, I think a lot of the rhetoric around the Me Too movement, the reaction is very masculine. It's like, that's the problem, not like, hey, let's sit down and talk about this, which I think is a more sort of like traditionally feminine concept. And that freaked me out because I've always felt so much like a woman, despite whatever masculinity I thought was well integrated. And I feel like that's what I'm in the process of doing now, is like redefining what it means to be a woman, and if I'm, I can be powerful, like I said, and smart and also sexy, and, having a guy look at me and be like, wow, that's like a sexy woman, is not inherently bad. It's what we do with it, or how we, what action someone decides to take. Like I was walking in a pizza place the other day, and I had like a low cut shirt on, which is already a little frightening for me, which still sort of boggles my mind that it is, but it is. And I'm walking through this pizza restaurant, and I'm trying my very best not to look any guy in the eye, because I think if I'm wearing this like sexy outfit and I look a guy in the eye, he's gonna think I want to fuck him, or that he can come and pick me up, And it's like, that's a cultural thing, right? Because in other cultures, that's not what that means. That just means like, hey, I'm a sexy, empowered woman, and I know it, and I'm looking you in the eye because I'm not afraid and I'm powerful, and that doesn't mean anything other than that. Or maybe it does. And cool, come over and ask me if I want to go out, and it's either yes or no, but the no isn't angry, it's just no, So yeah, I just think it's really interesting the ways that we view things and how we look at power through the lens of gender or sexuality or any of those things.
Yeah. I was talking with my girlfriend the other day about this. Like, we were talking, she had mentioned, well, we live in a very sexually repressed time. And I'm like, yeah, I guess so. I think that's true. But I also think we also live in this weird, perverted, and not perverted in the sense of like sexual perversion, but perverted in the sense of like distorted, like hypersexualized cultural images and values, and this kind of binary way of thinking where it's like you're either this or you're that, or you're this or you're that. Miley Cyrus will come out at the MTV Movie Awards wearing nothing and like nipple tassels and like humping some pink elephant or something like that, and it's this like hypersexualized image, and the movies and the music and the porn consumption and what porn shows, and how that's, there's a difference between like having intimate sex with somebody and having porn sex or just watching porn. It's a different thing. And I think there's a confusion that happens, and there's this weird, I want to get your thoughts on this, because it's like there's this kind of weird societally constructed, monogamous, get a house, family, kids, that kind of like linear progression of the modern American lifestyle. You don't just flash your tits out, and sexual. Like the other day, actually, we were on a hike, and Jenna had like pantsed me on the hike, and I think someone saw, and they were like, "Oh, we don't know what's going on over here. Oh, we might have to report you to the park police or something," kind of joking. Yeah. But we were just talking about this, like, what is it that's so like? But then we see like the number 3 most searched website is like YouPorn or whatever it is, Pornhub or something. And so it's like on one end you have this hyper-sexualized thing, and it creates a certain version of masculinity and femininity. And then we have this like really kind of like puritanical, like taboo, like, oh, don't show your nipple, like, we're afraid. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that stuff has to go somewhere, right? Because we are sexual. Like, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people, like girls on Instagram, will post like topless photos, but like, blur out their nipples or whatever, and then it's taken off Instagram, and they're like, stop sexualizing my body. Like, your body is sexual. Like, what the hell? What does sexualizing a body mean? Like, and if Instagram takes down my topless photo, I hope it's because it is sexual, not because they've like made a mistake.
Yeah, and why is that wrong?
Yeah. And so anyway, I think we relegate these things to other spaces. So it's like, well, if that porn sex can just exist there, then I don't have to deal with what that means if it's integrated into my own life. And honestly, like, I think, like, have porn sex. Like, a lot of it's fine, like, whatever you're into. And if we could, I think that's where a lot of abuse takes place, because we are projecting it. I think this is not just sex, but anything, right? Like we tend to project both our best and our worst qualities outward because we can't fucking integrate them in ourselves. Because it's challenging and it makes you think and it makes you different and it makes you unconventional and sometimes it makes you ostracized. And if you looked at any sort of like fundamentalist religion, like take Mormonism, for example, you know, to think that like all Mormons are going to be these like squeaky clean humans and none of them are going to be gay or, you know, want to be like tied up or something is ridiculous. Like they're humans just like anybody else. So what happens when you can't express that authentically? Well, it gets pushed into a closet, it happens in secret, or it comes out in abuse and anger. Because that's what happens when we aren't ourselves like that. That's why we have, I think, the abuse in our world.
Right, the energy has to be directed somewhere, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Right. So I think what we're seeing are just manifestations of humanity, but they're happening outside of us instead of inside of us. And the result of that is, I think, widespread trauma and abuse across the board, like under every category you can think of.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of heavy, right? When you look at it and you're like, oh my God, there's so much dirt under the rug. Like maybe if we just like picked the rug up and swept the dirt out, we could see like, hey, look at all this dirt. But there's something in American culture where we're afraid to look at that. Like, why do you think that is?
Well, because I think it has to do with that deconstruction process. I mean, the fact is, I'm reading I'm really into mythology.
Me too.
And especially looking at masculinity and femininity through the lens of mythology. And I read recently this great book. It was like, I'm always going to forget the name. I don't know the order, but it's like Lover, Warrior.
Oh, King, Warrior, Magician.
Warrior,
yeah, I have it right here. Yeah.
Great book. But he talks about how the reason we have all this boy psychology, or I also think girl psychology, is because we don't have any sort of like initiatory ritual, right? Like we don't have this process where people are becoming adults. And so we have all these quote unquote adults, but they're really just children masquerading around in adult bodies. So I think that's part of it, is that we're not maturing. And then I think the result of that is that we get all these older people that are super fucked up because they haven't been able to sort of like shed the bullshit of their childhood and the choices they couldn't make when they were too young. And I think that's what we're seeing now, at least in our generation, is people having to sort of initiate themselves, whether that's through psychedelics or through like intense grief. I think that's how I experienced it, or just travel or whatever it is. Like, I'm going to do this myself and I'm going to grow up. And you know, yeah, so I think I totally lost my fucking train of thought. What was the question?
Yeah, so like you're talking about how like the dirt under the rug and we have to initiate, self-initiate.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I think we, like as he talks about in this book, that required a community and it required elders and it required a structure in which to hold space for this person that was going through such a traumatic experience, because I think maturation is traumatic. We don't have those spaces and we don't have those elders. So you either do it by yourself and it's horrifying, or you just don't do it, understandably, because it's scary and you don't know where to begin. So I think, you know, to look at what's under the rug is like for me to examine that my parents weren't these like perfect, shiny specimens of a human, you know, and realize that like people who I held in such high esteem actually hurt me, albeit I recognize unintentionally they're dealing with their own trauma and their own crap. That was scary. And it, no matter what it is, like I just interviewed someone on the show, amazing guy who was raised Mormon, you know, and to realize that like the entire framework for your entire existence is bullshit. I can't imagine a more traumatic experience.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
It's very psychologically heavy. You know, it's, and I relate to this in terms of psychedelics because one of the first profound psychedelic experiences I had was like, oh, this is all a construct.
Yeah.
This is, and there's this great movie or documentary by Slavoj Zizek where he talks about, it's called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, and he's breaking down this one scene in the movie They Live by John Carpenter where Rowdy Roddy Piper gets these glasses, and when he puts the glasses on, he sees the true messages in society. So the poster for like take a vacation to the Bahamas, and like a woman and a man laying there, and it says like marry and reproduce, like when he puts the glasses on, like obey, you know, and that's where the obey kind of slogan comes from. And the money, it says like when he looks at the money with the glasses on, it says this is your God. And he tries to get a friend to put the glasses on. He's like, put them on, and they get into like a 10-minute fight, like a fist fight, because he doesn't want to put them on because he's so comfortable in the lies, in this constructed version of reality. He's invested so much in it that to go in a different direction can be really difficult and really challenging. But maybe we kind of have to, or maybe there's certain people that are going through things like what you've went through to come out the other side, that you can offer this and usher in sort of a new way, because we might need that. Otherwise, we might fucking destroy ourselves because we have a president who's a man baby who never went through a rite of passage, and he has his finger on the, you know, the nuclear button, and we could just blow up tomorrow.
Right.
You know, so this is very important. I think rites of passage are extremely important, and coming into your own power, you know, like accepting responsibility, not playing this victim role. We're all adults here, you know, and when we want to talk about equality between genders and stuff, it's like, yes, let's be equals. Like, let's step into the equal woman power and the equal man power. Not for you to be a man and not for me to be a woman, but to fully step into that power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like I'll sometimes use the phrase separate but equal when I'm talking about the gender thing, which I recognize is like super loaded and problematic, but I think it's important. You know, I think honestly, even in talking about race, like obviously black people are black and we're white. Obviously you are identified at least as a man, I'm a woman. These things can coexist and be different but equal, right? They can be expressed differently. Their value can be expressed differently, but no one is better or worse than the other. And I think that's really important. I even just individually, like, you know, in recognizing that there is no one else like you, and that your value is based on your own self, not anybody else, or how you compare to anybody else, or what society wants you to be. But yeah, I mean, and not only do we need to do that, but we need to support other people in doing it too, you know?
Totally, yeah, because we always forget. And
Yeah.
we need those like reminders. We need people to come over and remind us sometimes. Sometimes, you know, like my girlfriend will say like, oh, it's a sign from the universe. And I'll say that too, because it's like, okay, clearly we're being presented with a choice here. And there's a way that we can take this.
Yeah.
There's a way that we can see this. What would you say to some people, maybe some young women or just people in general, like listening, and, you know, maybe they can relate to your story, and, you know, that want to kind of get involved and do sort of the things that you're doing, how to kind of navigate that space and what to maybe look out for or to keep in mind and that sort of thing?
I would say, like, find your community. And if you can't find your community, start one. Because I think how a lot of this bullshit is perpetuated, by making people feel like they're alone, and making people feel like because you're different or whatever else that, you know, you have to conform. So, like, I always joke, I think everyone's like, oh, everyone has a podcast. Like, I'm happy everyone has a podcast. Like, have a podcast. If that means that, like, you get to create a community and with like-minded people in a society that is super isolated and tries to keep people separate and apart, do it. Do whatever you need to do. Have a voice. It doesn't matter how many people are listening, or if it's not a podcast, start a meetup group, you know? Like, in finding people, it's astonishing to me. And I always say, like, had I known I could have the life that I wanted, and that there were other people that believed similar things to me and wanted similar things to me and wanted to live a life in the same realm that I did, I mean, had I known that in my early 20s, maybe I wouldn't have made the same decisions that I did out of fear and a lack of belonging, you know? So I think that's vitally important, is to find yourself reflected elsewhere. And if you can't, create the community yourself. So start it and watch as people come to you. Like the podcast for me is super selfish in a lot of ways, because it's like, hi, I need some friends, so we're like, give myself a public platform. If you agree, come talk to me, let's hang out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, but that is what we need.
Yeah, so I think that like finding a community or starting it and being brutally fucking honest with yourself and doing the best you possibly can to, you know, one of my favorite things is like when you point your finger at someone, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you physically. So when you find yourself doing that, that person's the problem. That's what I need to blame. That system, that structure, that person, that gender, that race, that anything. Like, reflect back on yourself. How are you going to take initiative and take your power back and change whatever it is you think is the problem?
Right.
Because you can't ever change anybody. Like, I know we've all tried, you know, in relationships or whatever else. We think we can yell at someone until they'll figure it out, but it never works. They have to come upon it themselves, right? So it's just a waste of time. So instead of wasting your time trying to get other things and people to change, just like do you live the life you want to live, and watch how I think, you know, hopefully systems disintegrate around you. But if not, like, you just are an example to someone else that now feels safe enough to spend time with you and go through a similar process.
Right. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And you know, like, this brings us back to like the nuanced approach too, because on this podcast, if you look at like my description, what I wrote was, you know, we must look inward to heal ourselves first, but also recognize the external challenges as well. So what you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're not saying is just, it's all you go in and just, you know, because I've encountered people like this where, you know, maybe more in like sort of the Buddhist community or whatever, it's all about the inner work. It's all inner, just, you know, and I think Ram Dass says like anybody can be, you know, at peace if they're in an ashram in India. Try spending a weekend with your parents. So it's like getting into ourselves, checking with ourselves, and then like measuring that with the external world and seeing how we can kind of plug back in maybe and stay in that power and stay in that integrity, right? Because there are external challenges, there are systems, there are structures that we can't take on, you know, obviously. Like, I'm not going to like say something on this podcast and tomorrow the federal government will be like dismantled.
But
and,
wouldn't
like,
that be great?
Well, yeah. But like, hopefully that there could be this kind of group collective thing. So I'm wondering, like, as we're heading towards wrapping, like, we've been talking about your personal journey and doing the inner work and these challenges. What do you see as some of the external challenges we faced? I know yesterday you were talking about something really fascinating about the Beyond Burger and this whole problem with the carbon emissions and things. I think you put it better, but there are these things. There are a lot of, what do you see as kind of like the big kind of challenges of the moment that we face externally, that maybe if we do get in touch with ourselves, go to those dark parts, heal ourselves, that we can then walk into the world with this strong kind of like warrior approach to handle the real challenges that we face.
Yeah, well, and I agree. I don't think it's just inner work, although maybe that's somebody's journey. It doesn't feel like mine. Although I think part of what I try and explain is if we try to go out in the world to fix things before we've dealt with our own shit, it's like, as we see over and over and over again, therapists, people who like decide they're shamans, astrology teachers, all these people that have taken these, and even less formally, but like these healer roles, often are extremely narcissistic and are, again, sort of just projecting their problems out into the world, onto their clients, onto their followers, whatever. So I knew for me, if I was going to have this podcast and be like a quote unquote leader of any kind, that I was going to have to walk the talk, and I wasn't going to go out there and be a savior before I saved myself. So that's where I think the inner work comes in, is that if you want to do any of that type of work in the world, you have to do it yourself first. And you can be in process with that, but you have to be continually committed. And in terms of like what I think we need to do, I mean, everything. I think on my podcast, I sort of selfishly focus on issues that I think are really important and things I have experience in.
Yeah, which are?
So it's definitely gender and sexuality. I talk a lot about grief. I talk about regenerative agriculture, which I think most people think is like factory made meat. And for me, it's putting animals back on the land, because the way ecology works naturally sequesters carbon from the atmosphere. Like the world and the planet like works well, where we don't need to try and like create industrialized factories that are making, soy based bullshit products. Like that's not going to help. So regenerative agriculture, I talk about childhood trauma a lot, colonialism, race. Those, I think that probably, it's a lot of gender and sexuality stuff, because I just think like we are sexual creatures, and that kind of like looking at what people think are perversions, not just sexual, but otherwise, is a really unique way to look at things. I just try and like hit off on like every taboo I basically can. As politically incorrect as I can manage.
Just to have like a real open and raw, honest conversation about it.
Yeah. Like,
so, yeah.
I try to find space outside the conventional black and white narrative on all of these issues.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. So if you guys want to learn more, go to A Millennial's Guide to Saving the World on Apple Podcasts and everywhere podcasts are found. Anywhere else where people should go?
No, that's basically it. You could follow me on Instagram. It's just anya.cates. I post a bunch of pretty pictures on there.
Cool.
But yeah, that's about it. Yeah. Check out the podcast.
What are you doing right now? What's going on for you right now? What are you like getting into, learning about?
Yeah. Oh, good question.
Talking about.
Reading a lot about gender through the lens of mythology. I'm really like, my like small goal in the world is to fix the patriarchy problem.
What is it about mythology that you're so attracted to? Because I'm attracted to it too.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear what you think.
Stories. I think we understand ourselves, and I think we are stories, if that makes sense. And I want to write books, and so I want to write books that are tapping into ancient stories and the collective unconscious, because I think that's the way we learn about things. During this whole period, did a little stint in astrology, which I found a lot of issues with structurally, mostly. But what I found really useful was to like see myself and my patterns through the lens of stories. So basically, like all of astrology can be traced back to mythology. And so when it comes to solving big issues in the world and dealing with like complex personality patterns, it's really, really helpful to me to look at these like ancient, relatively like basic stories about how people act and where their desires or their fears are coming from, and apply those stories to what's happening in our world, both personally and collectively. So I don't think the conventional way at looking at patriarchy is where we need to go. And so I'm very inclined to delve into mythology to like figure that out in a way that is, again, like stripped of culture and is just like very human, I think.
Yeah, human, because I mean, look, like we have a tendency, I think, to look at these stories and go, oh, they're just old stories or whatever. But clearly, if they've lasted this long and they've gotten this far, it's like passing this baton with a scroll on it where everybody's writing their part. Yeah. And I think maybe it's time for us to write our part, because Joseph Campbell talks about this. These cultures of the past, they had their stories, they had their mythology for their time and place. And now, Daniele Bolelli wrote a great book, Create Your Own Religion, where he's talking about, let's take the good bits from all these places and apply it to today, where Campbell says we're living in this sort of like cesspool, or I think he says wasteland, because we have no story of our time. And the story that we need is a global story, because we are connected now with the internet and with everything. I mean, people that are listening to this podcast are in Iran and Pakistan and, all over the place. All over the world. Shout out to all of you people all over the world who are listening to this. It's amazing. And we do, I think, realize that we are all the same. and we are all different, and that's what the mythology says. And if we can apply it to this time, then maybe we can create something that can help inform us to move on to a more healthy, more truthful, and more productive and prosperous future.
Yeah, and just be like way more empathetic to each other's experience, because it's really just like regurgitation of the same stories playing out in different ways, and I think that's inspiring and beautiful. Yeah, and certainly frightening, but cool. I'm just like, I like it. I like the dark, shadowy places.
Me too. Yeah, and I feel like we have to go there.
Yeah.
If we're to really understand the full capacity of the human story and our place in it, we need to know like the nasty bits that maybe we don't want to know. And you know, some people are capable of doing that and some people aren't, and maybe some people are capable of just being followers to that message, and that's cool too.
It's all cool,
we need you no matter what you're doing. Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna wrap up, and I really appreciate your time. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I hope to do it again. I'm just thinking in my mind right now, just because of like what we were saying, and I don't know what it is. Maybe the debates are going on. If you were running for president,
Oh, man.
and you had like, you know, you're on CNN, and Anya Kate's like, hey, welcome to CNN. What's your presidential platform? Like, I'm wondering what that would be, just because you have such an interesting background and unique perspectives on things, and you're interested in these dark places and the mythology and gender and, you know, the constructs in which we operate in now. What would be like your pitch, I guess, to your presidential platform? Like, what do you want to say to the world?
Revolution.
Yeah.
Tear down the government.
Take it to the streets, people.
We can't fix it. We have to start over. Yeah, I don't think I'd make a very good presidential candidate. I think we need to.
Yeah, the non-PC presidential candidate. Give us the truth, Anya.
Yeah.
Give us the truth.
Yeah, it's the same sort of deconstruction.
Right.
I think we're due for a pretty harsh examination of what this country was founded on. And I honestly think until we are honest in that, and I'm not sure what we need to do to tear it down and start again, I think that process, I think that's going to happen.
So you think this is okay? Because I'm with you on this. You think this is inevitable, right? It's almost like if you're living a lie, or if you've done something, and you know whatever it is, you have this like baggage. It's gonna come up eventually, right? And the longer that you put it off, and the longer that you bury it, and the more lies that you put on top of it, it's going to erupt. It's going to burst one way or another.
Yeah.
So we're either going to go that direction, or we're going to realize like, hey, maybe we should take care of this, right?
Yeah, and look, I wouldn't be surprised if everything blows up at once. So some terrible environmental situation occurs simultaneous to some asshole like releasing biological warfare, and the government can't operate, and all of a sudden we're alone and like need to get like, I think my guess, very uneducated, but would be that like everything explodes all at once and we have no choice but to figure our shit out.
Boom. Perfect. Time to end.
So vote for me in the next election. And you'll probably die, but you can't control it anyway.
Vote for me. Everyone's going to die.
Yay.
Well, yeah, was there something else that you wanted to say?
No,
okay,
that was pretty much
Well, Anya, I completely agree with you, and I think, people listening out there, let's come together, form groups, listen to Anya's podcast, follow her on social media, get together, reach out, message her, and let's all come together, because when the shit does hit the fan, maybe we could have some kind of cool, decentralized, voluntary little groups of communities and tribes that are ready and waiting and saying, hey, we're here. We got the tools, we got the knowledge, we got the internet, we can research, we can learn about whatever we want. Let's start preparing to take over and create models that will be self-sustaining and will be healthy, that will sort of make these old crumbling ones obsolete, so that people can move into a new space and that container's formed and it's there, and you have your community and your tribe and I have mine, and other people have theirs, and we can form this kind of new Yeah, let's form a new constitutional Congress. I mean, it might
All
happen.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thanks again so much, Anya Cates. A Millennial's Guide to Saving the World. Go check it out. She's got fascinating conversations on there with all kinds of different people. You heard, the getting into the taboos, exploring the nuance, the gray area. Go check that out. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Mike. This was awesome.
Peace. Hey, I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Hope you guys like these podcasts and enjoy them. And if you do, please spread the podcast, share it, tell a neighbor, tell a coworker, tell a friend, tell a cat, tell a mouse, tell a dog, tell an ant, tell a firefly, tell whoever you tell. Share it, spread it, like it, all that good stuff. If you really love the show, you want to go a step further, you really want to help us out, leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And go to patreon.com, Patreon/Mike Brank, and patreon.com/Mike Brank. And you can donate as little as $1 a month, $2 a month, whatever you want. Help support the show that way as well. But remember, I love you guys no matter what you do. I just love that you tune in and you enjoy these podcasts. Message me. I like hearing feedback. Get in touch with me on Instagram, Mikeadelic Podcast, Mike Brank on Facebook as well. And thanks to our sponsors, Synchro and Hemp Bombs. If you want a discount on ketogenic and plant-based nutrition products, go to Synchro and type in the code Mikeadelic at checkout to get 20% off. And they have amazing ketogenic chocolate fudge called Keto Mana that I have all the time because it has like no sugar and carbs in it. So it's great. And it's delicious. And if you want CBD, go to hempbombs.com and get 15% off all your CBD needs, I guess. And just enter the code Mike15 at checkout. But thank you once again to everybody. Thanks to Danny Barnett and Galaxia for the music, the intro and the outro. I love you all. Peace.